Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Before lunch, we were talking about the Independent Review Group, the IRG's first interim report. I'd like to go back to that. If we can move on to paragraph 5.6, please. And this is again relating to governance and oversight. Speaking to those in more senior ranks at divisional level, it became even more clear that operationalisation of strategy is a significant barrier to progress. We gained a sense of 13 divisions all trying to reinvent their own wheel, and a concern that there is an urgent need to streamline and prioritise the number and range of initiatives so that they can work more effectively to improve culture and behaviours. A related concern is the service's approach to the evaluation of initiatives, which appears piecemeal and to lack consistency and rigour. The aforementioned creation of the executive post to lead the Policing Together programme will be addressing these matters, and we will be closely monitoring the effectiveness and impact of this work. We shall be reporting on this in the coming reports. And can I ask you about a number of things here? Operationalisation of strategy. What does that actually mean?
Well, I never wrote the report, so
No.
my interpretation
as a
of
concept,
it, my interpretation of it would be that there's always I suppose we talked about the gap earlier between the strategic direction and some of the middle management being set, and I think this can be the same, where strategic direction can be set, but how does that then manifest itself in practice day in, day out on the streets and the communities of Scotland? Now, in my view, that's always a challenge for any change, whatever the strategy relates to. But in actual fact, although there are challenges, this is one of the virtues of the single service. I worked as a senior police officer under the legacy arrangements, and trying to get consensus for the right direction between 8 forces was almost impossible. And then if it was then going to be implemented, there'd be different interpretations around implementation. So one of the values of the single service, as I see it, has been the fact that from decision making at a strategic level to implementation, that gap, that barrier, whatever it may be, has been reduced. But inevitably it does exist. It just takes that time of adjustment for people to change old practices or old habits and realise that the direction and the expectation that's upon them. And of course, you know, the Police Scotland is still a legacy, is still a relatively young organisation. So when you're trying to get that operationalisation of a single strategy, you will get different interpretations, often based on some of the legacy issues that arise. So there's always a challenge in different elements of policing.
right, so creating the strategy is one aspect, but implementing that strategy is then a second
Absolutely.
element. And they've talked about there being that process can be a significant barrier to progress. And is this something that you were aware of when you made your announcement that day regarding institutional racism, that there would need to also be underlying steps taken in relation to implementation of that strategy?
Absolutely. And you know, when I made the statement, again, there was some commentary about, well, you know, even people who welcomed it said, well, but how's that going to be delivered? But in actual fact, you know, we had already progressed and put together the Policing Together programme, and that alignment, that consistency of a very complex area across, you know, a third of the UK landmass, and the divergence of communities and the diversity of the communities that we have. So it is challenging, but it needs to be taken on. And you know, we would ask our divisional commanders and our local teams and divisions to take that strategic direction and implement it with urgency and implement it subject to the particular circumstances of their own communities, because they know them best.
And so in terms of implementing the strategy, would policing together be part of implementing that? We heard from Fiona Taylor about something called an action plan.
Yep.
Was that part of this implementation of steps necessary to achieve your aims?
The whole series of objectives, and then under the objectives, a whole series of actions that would be monitored, that would be reviewed. Maybe they're not appropriate. Maybe there's a reason one has been implemented relatively speedily or easily in one part of the country, but there's been potential barriers in another. And what's the reason for that? Is it internal? Is it external? So that's exactly what that was about. It was putting in, rigour and discipline to follow through on those actions. And again, that's something that DCC Taylor led on, and led on with real energy.
And as well as implementation, how then was the service intending to evaluate initiatives? They've said here the evaluation appeared to be piecemeal and lacking consistency and rigour at that stage. But what was the intention at this point regarding evaluation and improving evaluation of this strategy?
Well, part of the whole raison d'etre of Policing Together was to bring together these various, what's described as initiatives and work streams, and give a coherence to them, put it into a single area, and thereafter the evaluation, as I said, would be done through the monitoring of Policing Together, which was part of the programme that was developed. But it would also involve groups such as the IRG, that they would carry out, and I think, as it says here, they will monitor it and they will report it in the coming reports, and then undoubtedly the Police Authority would look for updates and reports. His Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary may choose to carry out an independent evaluation, but the evaluation and the closing the loop, for want of a better phrase, would be built into the Policing Together programme and alignment round about that. But there is a lot asked of policing, and there's a lot asked of divisions, and I mean by that from myself as the Chief Constable, and concern about the need of the number of initiatives and the amount of work that's been asked of them. That again wasn't unheard of to me, and I would always seek to try and align, and I would always try and make sure there was coordination. But actually, it is difficult, it is challenging, and within the divisions, I was asking them to step up and take on this challenge.
Did you feel at that time that, in terms of evaluation, that there was a clear vision as to how that would be evaluated?
It was developing inevitably. The implementation and the strategic direction being set, and then an evaluation mechanism with performance indicators, both formal in terms of data, but also in terms of other issues round about lived experience, and trying to create as much information and data to inform us that the progress was being made. So a complex area in terms of culture and behaviour, a complex area to seek change around and to monitor, but one that, again, I firmly believe was rightly being taken forward through the coherence of the Policing Together work.
And so was it your expectation that at that time, at least when in post ACC Duncan, would be considering evaluation as part of the work that was being done with Policing Together?
Absolutely. And if there was, the divisions felt that there wasn't that central control, that's exactly, or assistance, that's what the portfolio was designed to do. If there's a need for some deconfliction about pieces of work that were challenging or weren't aligned, again, that was something that the ACC would lead on and would have the dedicated time and space with a team to take that forward. So, this description at 5/6 from the IRG in May of 23, it's one that I would recognise, but it's one I think that, you know, people within Policing Together would recognise as well.
And to quote from your statement about institutional racism, you said, our success, the success of policing in Scotland, will be measured by the improved experiences of our officers and staff and of all the communities, all our fellow citizens who we serve. And was it part of your view that there would be some sort of mechanism where you could measure whether the steps you were taking and the new procedures you implemented were having a positive impact, both on communities, but also internally for staff?
Yes.
And you'd mentioned data and information and key performance indicators. Were these the types of tools that would be used to measure whether experiences were improving?
They would be. They would give us indication. Not, I don't think any single one source would be definitive, but it would be cumulative to get us to that outcome that you described, which is the trust and confidence of the communities that we serve.
And then finally, the final part of that paragraph there talks about the creation of the executive post to lead the Policing Together programme. Will be addressing these matters, and we, i.e. IRG, will be closely monitoring the effectiveness and impact of this work, and will be reporting on it in the coming reports. Was it part of your vision that IRG would have a role in this monitoring of the steps that were being taken, the strategy being implemented, and how it was evaluated?
Yes, it would provide that independence and that feedback that we would need.
And was it your expectation that that would be a continuous process, that
Yes.
they would be continuously monitoring?
Did you put any time scale on reaching certain milestones of achievement?
In terms of the ultimate outcome, no, because I actually think that's something that will take a number of years to address, Chair. In terms of the specific actions, I think Council referred to the action plan thereafter. There would be a number of those that would have time parameters on them, because they would be achieved, you know, within this year we will do A, B, C or D, and again we would look to do that. But the ultimate outcome, which would be to address the issues that we've talked about today of institutional racism and institutional discrimination, to build confidence and trust, well, that I felt was a sort of ongoing piece of work that would continue. But there was timescales. I certainly would expect timescales to be built into some of the specific actions that would help us on that direction.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we move on to paragraph 5.7, please? You'll see this is dealing with complaints and grievances. And the IRG write at 5.7, in her report, Dame Angelini, as she was then, commented on the need to improve frontline resolution and increase the use of less formal avenues to reduce conflicts. At this stage in our review, our impression is that the tendency to jump straight to formal grievance processes without the opportunity to pursue mediation persists with a consequential significant administrative burden. For senior managers, this can be a drain on time and resource, which prevents a clearer focus on driving improvement. So was this a change to the practice that was envisaged at the time you were Chief Constable? I think
I alluded to this earlier when you were asking me about issues on microaggression and why were they not taken as formal conduct issues. I think this actually, you know, reflects that the matters I think I was reflecting upon myself in as much that we were trying to give confidence to our leaders, our managers within the organisation, to deal with something that's right in front of them, and not to go into this formality, whether it's grievance, whether it's conduct, because we know that then creates structure and process when actually at times that's needed because it's proportionate to the issue of the mischief that we're seeking to address. But at other times it could be a misunderstanding, it could be a lack of awareness, and actually that potential for looking to mediate or to bring early resolution was something we were keen to do, and that again is linked into the training and the Your Leadership Matters work that we were looking to do to give our senior line managers and sergeants and others the confidence to take those early resolution points that are mentioned at 5.7.
And so this came from the report in 2020 by Lady Angelini. And was the service considering whether introducing the option of mediation might produce a resolution quicker, faster, to improve communication between the individuals involved?
Well, there's a combination of things here. The issue on grievance is obviously separate from conduct, but again, one can lead to the other. And in terms of the grievance process, certainly that is often against one member of Police Scotland against another, and that's certainly something that again, we would strongly seek to get that early resolution. And similarly with complaints from a member of the public, again, an explanation, if done properly, if done at the right time, and an expectation that an understanding from the officer involved in terms of their learning and improvement. Often that was the best solution for all, and again it would mean that there wasn't this excessive process-driven approach that at times was unsatisfactory. So I think both on grievance and on conduct, the trying to get early resolution and using matters such as mediation and other tools, I think was something as a direction we were keen to go.
So a recognition that perhaps the conduct regulations may not be the only option to resolve issues that arose within the service.
Absolutely, which again I think is consistent with what we discussed this morning.
Thank you. Can we move on, please, to 5.8? Alternatively, we encountered a degree of scepticism and even outright fear about raising concerns at all, either informally or formally, because it can just lead to the person being moved or the issue being avoided. We heard of people being punished for raising issues or concerns, for example, being sidelined within teams or moved to a less convenient location. And I think we touched on this earlier today. Would you have any comment to make in regard to that?
That's the feedback that the IRG have received. They've obviously been speaking to officers and staff, and then presenting it in the report. And I would recognise that. And at times, I said the scepticism and fear about raising a concern, because often it was quickly formalised. I sometimes think it's because it's almost the keep yourself right type of approach, if you like. Well, if I put this on paper and I deploy a formal process, whether it's grievance or conduct, it would be difficult for me to be criticised thereafter. So I understand why that could be done, but it's not necessarily the best approach. Not necessarily the best approach for the person who has raised the concern or the grievance, or even raised it, as I said here, informally. But people in leadership positions who are subject to high levels of scrutiny, a number of whom, as I said, had not had the training that we should have provided, and we were seeking to address that, and we did address that. At times, if you're not confident in your own judgment to do the right thing and to assess it, well, actually it can lead to a more not the most appropriate solution for the issue at hand. So I think that was consistent with, again, other discussions that we've had today as well, about how we wanted to move to allowing people to do the right things, to address things early and improve things, rather than unnecessarily creating a burden.
And do you think those changes being implemented would also help individuals who may have a concern or an issue, who may be facing racism of some description, but fear raising the matter for potentially being punished or sidelined or moved to a less convenient location or matters of that sort. So it would have some sort of detrimental impact on their career. And with the changes you're suggesting, would it be your hope that they would minimise this concern that individuals may have?
In an ideal world, the optimum, it would eliminate it, because somebody raises a concern legitimately. If it's of magnitude, well, again, processes we would put in place, there would be support structures in place. But even something, as we were talking earlier, a microaggression or a relatively low level concern, the sooner that's addressed and dealt with, the better for everyone involved. And we were encouraging people to step forward. We not only encouraging people, we were saying that it's your duty. That was what lay behind, right at the outset of the public inquiry, my desire for us to be anti-racist. It's a proactive responsibility that one has, every member of the organisation, to raise a concern. And actually, it's not good enough to say, well, it wasn't the right thing to do, but I didn't want to say anything. And we as an organisation needed to create a culture that people would be recognised for that and supported it, because that is for everyone's interest. It would make the organisation better and ultimately allow us to provide a better service to the public.
And for those who, would you hope ultimately that Police Scotland would reach a stage where those raising concerns, legitimate concerns regarding racism, that raising that would not have any detrimental impact on their career?
Absolutely.
Yet, would you also want to make sure that anyone who is engaging in racist behaviour is dealt with appropriately?
Again, absolutely.
Could we look at paragraph 5.9, please? We also heard of poor behaviour being known and seen in plain sight with no action being taken. A vicious circle of the personnel affected not having the confidence to report concerns, peers not speaking up, and managers not taking action, exacerbated where the concern relates to a manager. Does this cause you concern that this is something the IRG are saying they're hearing of that type of behaviour?
Yes, and again, that's, as I said earlier, that's exactly what we were seeking to address by stating our aim to become an anti-racist service, that it's not good enough to be a bystander or to sit by. Now, the IRG are reporting on this. These have instances of this. I think it would be incorrect to represent this as being the norm. I think there are some instances where action was taken, where the people did step forward, but if there was a lack of confidence and it wasn't happening all the time or every time, or it was happening, it wasn't happening in a number of occasions, that is really concerning. But again, as I said, that was what lay behind the changes we were wishing to make, was to address that and ensure that it didn't continue.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 5.14, the role of middle people management? Thank you. We encountered significant concerns about the absence of effective performance management systems during the first decade of Police Scotland's existence. Middle managers, sergeants, inspectors, chief inspectors, were considered to be the most neglected in this regard, and at the same time the most important in helping to understand and shape culture on the front line. Do you recognise this criticism by the IRG?
Again, I think I described that earlier this morning, Council, when the 10 years or the early years of Police Scotland, we didn't invest in our people in terms of their well-being, their training, their capability. We didn't invest in that against other competing priorities at the time. And when I came into the role of Chief Constable, I said that on a number of public occasions. That paragraph of 514, candidly reflects things I'd said myself, and I may have discussed that with members of the IRG.
And at 5:15, it says, we heard repeatedly that people are not assessed, trained to be managers, and that promotion is secured by demonstrating technical skills and experience. Middle managers were described as the sponges who had to absorb issues from the top and bottom, resulting in pressing and competing workloads with insufficient training and guidance. And we have heard evidence in the inquiry about officers who were acting up or in temporary roles, but who perhaps had not gone through training in relation to carrying out those duties, those roles. Again, what concerns did you have about this? Do you recognise this as an issue?
Similar to what I said above, that describes the gap that we were seeking to address through the Your Leadership Matters work that we initiated. This report was in 2023, and we'd kicked off the leadership training programme to ensure that our superintendents, our sergeants, our chief inspectors, the people who are mentioned here, were given that support that they hadn't been given in the early years when the new organisation was coming together, where we were delayering management levels. But I was conscious that there was a gap, that we were promoting people into roles, asking a lot of them, often giving them technical training on their specific discipline or their specific area of work, but actually the leadership training and the management training on how to deal with individuals had been neglected. So what I read there, I shared, but we, under my tenure as Chief Constable, I was seeking to address it with energy and resources through the Your Leadership work that we were doing.
Can we look at 5:18, please? This is under the heading Training and Development. The use of self-directed learning via Moodle was almost universally criticised among those we have spoken to. It was repeatedly referred to as a tick box approach and easy to work around. While it was seen as having some value in relation to technical or factual matters, such as changes to legislation, it was considered to have little or no value in relation to raising awareness of EDI-HR issues and driving changes in attitudes and values. We've heard some evidence about Moodle, which we understand is a computer system that is training via e-learning, digital learning. This seems to be very critical of Moodle. Were you aware of these criticisms when you were Chief Constable?
Yes. I was Chief Constable through, many significant challenges, not least of all the global pandemic, and that had an impact on our ability to reach out to staff physically. And one thing it did do, it did, force us, if you like, to look at how we provided e-learning and how we do things remotely. Now, policing is not the only sector in society that increasingly delivers training through e-learning. It's something that everybody has to adjust to. There is a scepticism about it, and there is a resistance to it. I think at times unfairly. I think properly put together, there is a role for e-learning, and our ability, as I've said, to deliver across a third of the UK landmass to each and every member of our staff needs a level of flexibility. So we needed to continue it. We needed to make sure that it was more engaging, it improved as a quality product, and that it was supported at the right time with face-to-face, where you've got that more of that personal intimacy that can develop training. But e-learning and remote training, I don't think is the challenges around that to make sure the product is fit for purpose is not confined to policing, but it's something that, again, I think it's legitimate for us to continue to have used it, but to make sure that it was appropriate and that at times it was also supplemented by face-to-face.
And as part of the evaluation of that type of training, who would be doing that?
Well, the people delivering the training would probably start with that, because as everybody knows, you go on a training course, one of the things you get at the end of it is give us feedback, what was good, what was bad. And then again, it's an area that through the Policing Together work, I would expect, a more strategic assessment to be done with that detail. And if it involved the IRG, again, that would provide that level of independence.
Was there any plans to go back to people after they've completed Moodle to see if that training has had an impact on their behaviours?
I'm not sure on the specific plans whether that was one of the actions, but it sounds entirely sensible to do that.
519, it was considered to be particularly ineffective for officers in frontline roles, which were not primarily desk-based. Would a frontline role include a response team or that type of work within Police Scotland?
It would. I mean, the phrase frontline is one that I think many people working in frontline policing is not necessarily working in a response role, but the response officers would definitely be working in frontline policing.
Thank you. We heard consistently that valuing EDIHR should mean making proper time for it and delivering training face to face, which should be targeted at those who need it and made a proper requirement. Would there be merit in considering different methods of training for officers in frontline roles, such as in response teams, compared to those who are perhaps primarily desk-based?
Not necessarily, because you don't have a response role for 30 years in your police service, and you don't necessarily have a desk-based role for 30 years in your police service, and the distinction can mix. You can be, even as a frontline officer, you may go into a particular function at a particular time, and actually the impact of you as an individual and your colleagues and the members of the public can manifest itself in different ways. So I would be looking for a consistency of the curriculum in terms of values, in terms of understanding, but always potential flexibility about how that's delivered. And it's the challenge from busy urban centres where it's maybe quite easy to bring a large group of officers or staff together for training, and then other parts of our country where our resources are massively spread geographically. So it would always have to be tailored to the particular demands, but I would always look, if we were doing a consistent work around about EDI, that there would be a core training that everybody should take, and that's something, again, that we sought to implement. But the means of doing that, I think, we're be constantly reviewing to try and make sure that it was done in the best way.
I'm thinking about the significance of training and good quality training in equality, diversity and inclusion, particularly in relation to issues of racism and underlying racism, and the recognition of that, the awareness of that amongst officers. Thinking of a response team who are going out to deal with members of the public and have the option, at least, of considering restraint, which we have heard can risk the death of a person. Would you not see merit in perhaps enhancing training for people who are part of a response team, officers who are dealing with members of the public?
Detective officers, road policing officers, firearms officers, there's a multitude of disciplines within the Police Service of Scotland where people come into to contact with members of the public, where there's always that potential for an escalation. There's always a potential where you're going to have to use powers of coercion. So however it was tailored, we need to make sure that as much and as high quality, because it's not just volume of training, it's quality of training, that as much quality training was given to the officers who deal with members of the public. But I genuinely see the training required as being something that there has to be a universal element of that. Potentially, as I've said, training is a key part of Policing Together. I think we talk about it as a pillar, as a building block, whatever the language is. So So training would be fundamental to that, and there would be an awful lot of work getting done, and it potentially could be nuanced in the way that you suggest, but based on a core that every member of the service should be receiving.
Certainly we've heard evidence that firearms officers receive very enhanced training. As I understand it, part of the reason for that is they are carrying weapons which can kill. But my understanding is that that's not the same type of training that's given to response teams, although response teams could resort to restraint, which can also have the risk of death.
Well, is this EDI training, or is this training for the role?
Well, I'm talking about, I don't have specifics about firearm training. We've heard that it's enhanced training.
Well,
more regular,
yeah.
more stringent training, more detailed training.
So the principle of bespoke training for particular roles is one that applies all the time. That enhanced training would probably be around de-escalation, around about conflict, enhanced training on first aid. The EDI training, I think every officer would require, every member of staff would require that understanding. Whether you could be working in a police control room, taking telephone calls, you could be working as a frontline officer. But the principle of providing additional or bespoke training, depending on role, is one that's well established. So again, you would always consider it. But the difference in response and firearms is less on equality, diversity and inclusion, and more on those other matters I talked about in terms of de-escalation and first aid.
So firearms officers are given enhanced training on de-escalation, conflict and first aid.
Amongst others, as well as clearly all the technical
and
skills of firearms.
Sorry, I interrupted
Sorry,
you.
no.
As part of the reason for that is because they carry weapons and they can kill a subject. So they are trained to a higher standard to learn about de-escalation and options which would not involve the use of deadly force.
Yes, but not in terms of EDI. So I mean, the paragraph 519 talks about EDI training. So in that instance, it's because firearms officers are there and are deployed and are trained to deal with highest threat levels, and therefore they require that additional technical training. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the wider training on equality, diversity and inclusion, that's something that as I say, I feel that every officer and member of staff should have.
We've heard evidence about unconscious bias, and we've heard evidence about the speed at which stereotypes can be relied on by the brain to make decisions and judgments about, for example, the use of force. And having heard that evidence and having heard about unconscious bias and elements of racist discrimination, that those stereotypes can be relied on, and they may be racist stereotypes. Do you not see any improvements that could be made in training, not just in relation to de-escalation and other techniques that don't involve force, but in also enhancing the understanding of officers who have the option to use deadly force, to truly understand and be conscious of and aware of this potentially unconscious bias, which could be resulting in very quick judgments being made in a state of unconsciousness, which are based on discrimination?
Yes, but I would want to extend that beyond firearms officers in the particular example you give me. Mm-hmm. Now, in Cheku's death, as we know, it was response officers that attended. Firearms officers did not attend. So that ability, when you're, as you've heard, as you've outlined evidence of how people respond where they're under pressure, where it's instinctive, intuitive, rather than based on judgment or training, and issues of unconscious bias arise. Again, it's something I think that needs to be applied to all our officers and staff. Now, as a firearms officer, I believe that, again, in terms of their training, how they respond and the expectation that they will not have an intuitive response, but have a response based on their training. That's part of the selection criteria, it's part of the training programme. But it's something I think that, again, can't be just confined to specialists. We'd like to give it to all officers and staff, because at any time you could be in that position.
So where an officer has the potential to use deadly force as part of their operational duties, you can see a place for giving enhanced training in relation to issues of discrimination, equality, diversity, inclusion.
Yes. As ideally, I would like to give it to anybody who would come into contact with a member of the public, because that potential for high-end conflict is always there.
Thank you. Can we move on to 520, please? We have heard considerable scepticism that training and development is not mandatory or assessed in any meaningful way. In particular, we were told that Moodle was ineffective in driving the culture, values and behaviours needed to make policing together real on the ground, including good people and performance management. So again, the IRG seem to be criticising assessment of Moodle training and saying that it's ineffective in driving culture change. Was that something that you were addressing in Police Scotland?
Yes, it's similar to the discussion I had earlier. I mean, the scepticism is something that, again, I alluded to. I don't think at times it's entirely legitimate. I think that there are limits on e-learning. As I said before, this is something that's beyond policing. Everyone will have had experience, I'm sure, of some level of e-learning and the limitations that it provides. But it does have its use at the right time, but it has to be supplemented by additional training, as I said earlier. So again, that scepticism doesn't surprise me. It was still the challenge of us trying to ensure that we could get training delivered in a way and in a speedy manner. And it was certainly the starting point rather than the end point in the training that we were looking to introduce.
Thank you. If we move on to 612, we'll see a chapter entitled Getting to Grips with Culture. But I'd like to look at paragraph 6.19, 619. And this is guarding against backlash. There was a risk, in our experience, there's always a risk of backlash when driving EDIHR. We have observed some evidence of this in our work to date. For example, we encountered the sense that minoritised staff are receiving preferential treatment, being needy, or getting more than they deserve. A concern that diversity staff associations are out to get their colleagues or not acting in the interests of the overall workforce, and concerns about how EDIHR issues are taken forward in divisions which are less diverse. And again, was this something that was recognised within Police Scotland? And if so, what steps were being taken to address it?
This is back to the need for us to be anti-racist and for every individual to recognise the legitimacy of the position that I was outlining regarding institutional racism and institutional discrimination. But I knew that there would be a backlash. I know that this, these cynical quotes and views that are expressed exists there. But again, to make the change, which won't be overnight, which won't be immediate, to make the change, the starting point was the recognition and confirmation of those institutional issues, combined with real action and real activity under the Policing Together work. So that describes, again, the mischief that I was looking to address, and that my statement regarding institutional racism and institutional discrimination was intended to be a foundation to go forward and counter those type of views.
Thank you. Can we look back again, please, at 614? This was the Getting to Grips with Culture chapter, and this is where IRG say, while acknowledging that transforming culture requires long-term and sustained focus, we think there are steps which Police Scotland can take in the near term which will help to build the foundations for change. And there's 4 bullet points. Developing a clearer narrative about why a more inclusive culture would benefit the service both internally and externally. And what steps were being taken prior to your retirement that would have allowed that bullet point to be addressed?
Well, I think I initiated the narrative by saying that, you know, unless we recognise the institutional challenges that we have, we can't make that progress. And as I said earlier, the people who were strongly opposed to that tended to be individuals who hadn't had that level of awareness. Those who had supported it, ones who had encountered those discriminations, people from minority groups or people who had seen either overt discrimination or had been subject to some of the thoughtlessness and some of the behaviours that were outlined in Lord Macpherson's meaning around that. So a clearer narrative was at the centre of the Policing Together work, and the starting point was a confirmation and a statement that these institutional issues existed.
And as well as your own steps in making that statement about institutional racism, are there any other examples you can give us of how that clearer narrative being developed was, we've heard a phrase, cascaded down amongst officers at a less senior rank than yourself?
There was a whole sort of communications plan, if you like, that we produced with questions and answers. There was an expectation that divisional commanders would go to their senior team, that team leaders, inspectors of teams, that sergeants would take those, and actually an expectation of what the challenge might be. Well, does this mean we're all racist? Is the chief saying we're all racist, boss? No, that's not what the chief's saying. To assist people to go and have those discussions. And again, after I said that took place, and there was feedback. I think some of those conversations were challenging because not everyone agreed with the position that I had articulated. But that narrative about how crucial it was for the inclusive culture to allow us to do our job, as I said earlier, internally and externally. And if we're not treating people with dignity, fairness, respect, recognising their needs as police officers and police staff, we're not going to be able to go and do it for members of the public. So the internal and external ties were there, and the narrative was exactly as you described it. It was cascaded, and there was an expectation that everybody would have the conversations with their teams.
And the next bullet point, avoiding a one-size-fits-all to understanding the way canteen and locker room culture manifests across the service, and therefore what needs to be done to change behaviours. How was that to be implemented in the short term? Well, again,
the IRG's contribution was one of many to the work that we were seeking to do. And actually, I think the Policing Together work and the programme of work I understood these challenges and probably informed the IRG's report. But this talks, I think, about something, again, that we know, that there's no single culture, if you like, in an organisation. Individual units can have their own culture. Firearms, for example, we knew that had been problematic in terms of misogyny, in terms of female officers coming into firearms. So that, you wouldn't have a one-size-fits-all understanding. But we were aware of that. Geographic areas as well, there might be different manifestations in that area as well. So again, it's making sure that the changes and the sensitivities around about culture are recognising, again, as I think I said in my Rule 8 statement, that that there is a multitude of cultures and subcultures, and I think that's what bullet point 2 is alluding to.
So is this about identifying what those cultures and subcultures are and where they exist, and then identifying how that behaviour can be changed.
Yes.
And then ensuring EDIHR is embedded in the promotion process in terms of what is sought and expected by panels. This is not about a single question. Was that taken forward? I said a moment ago in the short term, but the IRG described it as in the near term. So was this embedded in the promotion process?
Specifically, I couldn't recall the detail of that. What we had done over, actually as a development on our commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there used to be a specific, diversity section, if you like, on an interview. So you'd be asked it and then you'd come to diversity. And there was a realisation, and it's obvious, clearly, but the realisation that really this is something that should go through all competencies that you're asking an individual around. So the assessment round about it was, if you like, was integral to the whole process. So exactly as I said, it's not a single question. How the promotion processes, they continue to evolve. Again, we developed them. We put more mechanisms into them to try and make them values based. We invested in that because that takes time. It takes assessor time, which comes from the senior officer cadre. But it was so important to do, and a lot of that was to make sure that not only were we promoting people who had the competence and the technical experience and knowledge, but they had the values and they had that commitment to EDI that I would expect.
So were there specific actions appointed for recruitment, promotion, interview panels and the like?
Well, the promotion process was being developed. It wasn't being developed, candidly, on the back of that bullet point on the IRG's work. That what the IRG are reflecting is something that was in train and was being progressed.
Right. And then the final bullet point, ensuring a concerted focus on face-to-face learning and development for middle managers. This is not about a single course or module and requires the use of a range of interactive tools such as peer intervention. And I think you've talked about that already as being a part of the work that was intended as part of policing together.
Yes, and again, I agree with that, Councillor. I would say that the criticisms of Moodle e-learning, I was probably as cynical about them as anyone, as in terms of the use of IT and once we're all products of our own generation. But this was something, again, when we kicked this off, this was through the pandemic. This was into 2020, into 2021 when we started to look at these training programmes, and we had to make use of those. It was either that or nothing. So similar with the Your Leadership Matter works, a lot of that started online, and again, it was done through Teams and other mechanisms. But we always knew that was what was required at the time. It got the programme up and running. But the need for face-to-face and peer interventions and that work was always something that, again, we knew we were going to develop and further. But I think the need for that e-learning, it was of necessity given the circumstances during that period.
Now this report was the first IRG report. It came out in the May. To the SPA the same date you were giving your statement on institutional racism. And the introduction to the report says that this will be the first of 2 interim reports, and there will be a final report from the IRG. And we, the inquiry team, have checked over a number of months, and it would appear that as things stand to date, there is no second interim report or final report. And the next meeting of the SPA is scheduled for Thursday the 27th of June, and the agenda has been published, and again, there's no specific reference on that agenda to any report or otherwise from the IRG. So since May of last year and the publication of this report, there hasn't been a second interim report or a final report. The final report, as I understood it, was due to be published at the beginning, in the early part of this year.
Okay.
We've also heard evidence that you've retired. ACC Duncan has left the role, and DCC designate Fiona Taylor has retired. And the new lead ACC, ACC Peyton, took up post earlier this month. When, at the point of your retirement, were you aware of reasons for the delay in the second interim report or progress towards the final report with the IRG?
No, I wasn't. And I'm surprised IRG hasn't continued with it work, because it, you know, the membership was committed, and again, I didn't. What you've told me today, I didn't know before you told me that about there hasn't been subsequent reports, and I wouldn't be in a position to say why that might be.
All right. Thank you very much. Could you give me a moment, please?
Yeah, of course.
Would that be an appropriate time for the afternoon break?
Yes, we'll take a 15-minute break.
Let's go and see where we are.
That's great.
Thank you. Over the break, I've been advised that the IRG final report is in the process of going to an SPA meeting in September of this year. So
Good to hear.
it was worthwhile raising the
Yes,
matter with
thank you.
you. The other matter that's been raised with the inquiry team relates to the previous paragraph that we looked at, 614 of the IRG report. And that was in relation to the comments about promotion, and EDIHR should be embedded in the promotion process. And we can have it back on the screen if you prefer. So this is the IRG report, which we were looking at just before the break, SBPI 00643, and it was paragraph 614. And one of the bullet points was about 614. There we are. Ensuring EDIHR is embedded in the promotion process in terms of what is sought and expected by panels. And this is not about a single question. And you've already given me an explanation of that in your answer. We've been provided with a review carried out by Baroness McGregor Smith, CBE, about mechanisms of change in business, not in relation to Police Scotland. And there was a roadmap to success as part of that. We have it, and for those behind me, it's SBPI 00642, but I won't ask that that be put on the screen. But in relation to recruitment and the issues of those matters, some of the guidance and recommendations that they have made generally for businesses is to have name-blind recruitment, diverse interview panels, equality and diversity management systems, and role modelling and mentoring as priorities in the business. Are these aspects that you would expect Police Scotland to be considering as part of overall recruitment, promotion, interviews, things of that sort?
Potentially. I mean, the issue on recruitment, in terms of name-blind recruitment, that's a challenge when vetting is so important. And we talked about Dame Eilish earlier. I, as one of my other roles since I retired, I sit as on a reference group that Eilish has established for her work in terms of the disgusting conduct of Wayne Cousins and the murder of Sarah Everard, and the review work that's been carried out there. And some of the early work was on vetting, and one of the suggestions for new recruits was to reintroduce home visits, where the individual and their circumstances were part of that process. So that wouldn't, the vetting challenges against suggestion of name-blind recruitment, I don't think would be practical. You know, there again are numerous elements of it. But in terms of seeking to identify best practice wherever it exists, you know, I've said this a number of times. If somebody can point me to an organisation that is an exemplar, or a sector of Scottish life, British life, anywhere that's an exemplar of equality, diversity and inclusion, we'll go there. But I think these are massively challenging issues for everyone, for all of us. But wherever best practice exists, I think it would be foolish not to look at it.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now and look at SBPI 00484, and this is the HMICS thematic inspection of organisation culture in Police Scotland. And this is dated December 2023. So I appreciate that you retired in August, but it covers part of the period when you were Chief Constable. And what I'd like to do is go through some of the elements that are mentioned within this document and ask you for your comments. If we could look, please, first of all, at, as I understand it, there are 155 pages on this as a PDF. And so the first page I'd like to look at is page 13 of the PDF, but as we look at the page, we will realise that this is actually page 11 of the actual report. But if we can turn to page 13 of the PDF. Here we are, key findings. And during this report, there are a number of areas where they highlight key findings and they express these as bullet points, paragraphs, and I'd like to go through some of these with you. If we can go to the middle of the page, I'd like to ask you about, we found that, here we are. We found that financial and resource constraint was one of the primary factors adversely affecting culture change, particularly at the front line, both in terms of driving behaviours as well as impacting on capacity, motivation and well-being. And you've mentioned financial constraints in this day and age, and I wonder if you would like to expand on that slightly in terms of the chair, in terms of actually implementing change. To what extent would financial and resource constraint be a factor for the service?
It would always be a factor. I think I mentioned earlier of the increasing expectations, the increasing community needs that policing's asked to meet, increased new legislation that's introduced, often with very little or minimal consultation or assessment around about financial implications. And that, all of that, contributes to those financial and resource constraints that are mentioned in the HMI report. And I do feel very strongly on the financial pressures that policing's under in Scotland, because I don't think that there has been sufficient recognition from government in terms of funding on the fact that policing in Scotland has actually gone through significant reform and restructure, and it's a matter of record through Audit Scotland that policing is £200 million a year at least cheaper now per year than it was under legacy arrangements in real terms. Now that's an enormous amount of money out of a 1.2 billion budget, and yet at the same time, in my judgment, we have been able to improve service consistency and achieve some of the objectives of reform. But there gets to a position where, because reform and the single service has now established, that budget, that need for financial protection, it can't continue to be diminished, particularly as there's already been a return to the public purse because of the reform agenda for different reasons. One of them being a reduction in senior ranks. There's over 30 members, I think, of ACPO Scotland when I was in ACC in Edinburgh back in the 2000s, the late 2000s, and yet now we're into 17, less than that, 13, 14 chief officers. That's just one example, but that puts pressure and demand into senior leadership teams. So the financial and resource constraints in any element, we want to develop training, we want to do more face-to-face. People are concerned about the amount of e-learning that's required. All of these come with a cost, and all of these come with a demand, and that has to be prioritised. This was prioritised. The Policing Together work was prioritised. We did recruit additional resources into that. We put in a bespoke and specific additional chief officer to lead that. But we know resource pressures are there, and I absolutely recognise the pressure on operational police officers and police staff in terms of their well-being and that motivation, that ability to give discretionary effort when you yourself don't feel fully valued. So the financial pressures, I think, are significant, and I actually, as I've said before, and I'll repeat, I think policing as a sector has more than taken its fair share of financial restrictions since 2012, and if it's going to continue to provide the service that this country needs and deserves, it has to be funded accordingly.
And so in terms of implementing change in regard to equality, diversity, inclusion and human rights issues, as we've been talking today, would you consider it reasonable to, well, necessary to prioritise, but also reasonable to perhaps prioritise training and other matters in relation to situations where there is potentially engagement with police, with members of the public, and there is a risk of death or a risk of a serious incident occurring?
Absolutely, and that's why, as I described, it was done, why Policing Together was created, why there's specific resources going into that. But it comes where other parts of the service are being stretched, and therefore it's that challenge that you need to support the officers in community teams and specialist teams and child protection teams who are doing incredible work for public safety and public well-being. But if their resource base has been challenged because, as the Chief Constable, I've decided I need to invest in EDI rightly, there's almost an unintended consequence. It might put additional pressure onto those teams who we are seeking to help and support in terms of developing and maintaining the culture. So operating in that context, it is really challenging, but that's the responsibility of the leadership team and the Chief Constable.
Can we move on to page 14 of the PDF, please, which is page 12 of the report? And you'll see the second bullet point there. It's just the Police Scotland has previously acknowledged that there remain cultural and behavioural issues that can result in unfair or inequitable treatment in the service. We were notified of a number of individual cases of such treatment and have taken related policy, process and procedural matters into account in these findings. The perception of a lack of organisational justice was reflected in much of the evidence we collected. So it would appear that the HMICS is also collecting evidence as well as the IRG and through other sources. And would you like to comment on this phrase, the perception of a lack of organisational justice?
I'm not entirely sure what it means in terms of whether it's procedural justice within the service. I mean, I would read that as being supportive of my determination regarding institutional discrimination, that there has been unfairness and a lack of equity in how individuals have been dealt with in terms of behavioural issues. Organisational justice, I suppose that would relate to proportionality and equity, but again, I didn't write the report, and again, candidly, it's the first time I've seen it.
All right, thank you. Well, this was published in December 2023, which was after you'd retired.
That's right.
As I said. Can we look at this next section, leadership and vision, leadership behaviours, and it's the first bullet point and the final sentence there. As yet, it is unclear how aligned and sustainable these will be and how Police Scotland will fully assess the ongoing impact of this wide-ranging work. And this, sorry, I should have read the first sentence. Police Scotland is planning and undertaking a number of initiatives to embed appropriate leadership behaviours, attitudes and values at all levels in the service, and you've talked about that today, but as yet it's unclear how aligned and sustainable these will be. Do you think that's a fair reflection of where Police Scotland were when you retired? Maybe the clarity regarding how aligned and sustainable they were was not quite clear.
It was developing, definitely. I mean, it has to be sustainable. This is a long-term commitment and a long-term journey, for want of a better phrase, that the organisation needs to be on. But I think that we've talked about, your leadership matters. We've talked about the work that's been done. We've talked about the alignment with the Policing Together work, how training is at the core of that. And yeah, fair enough. Obviously, we need to ensure that it sustains, and as I think there's the HMI saying, they'll come back and make comment on that.
Thank you. Could we look at page 18 PDF, please? Page 16 of the report. I'm interested in the second last bullet point, please. Under organisational learning, we identified good practice work in a number of policing areas where a culture of consistent evaluation, debriefing and governance of organisational learning is in place. But overall, there remains a fragmented and inconsistent approach. Although learning is promoted, there remains a perceived blame culture within the organisation, which is considered as a barrier to this. Was it part of Policing Together and the action plan that was devised designed to counter the perceived blame culture, which may have been a barrier to change?
Yes, again, it's that confidence to be honest, to share an issue rather than holding something back, to ensure that the organisation does learn. That the ability to capture learning has always been not just in policing, is a real challenge. You know, everybody talks about organisational learning and that it would remain, but the challenge is putting structures and processes in place that captures that. And again, the sense of a perceived blame culture, again, that's a phrase I've heard throughout my career as a police officer, and there is a perception. I mean, against that, I would say, you know, policing has to be highly accountable. If you hold the office of constable, regardless of your rank, you know, you must be accountable for your decisions and your actions. Now, if that is perceived as a blame culture, you know, that is the colloquial term that's often used, but it's important that supportive mechanism, the ability and the confidence to speak openly and to make challenge and to raise an issue without it being pushing back on you, the whole sort of black box concepts that we've heard over a number of years of calling things out and making sure the organisation supports that and you're given credit for that. That is entirely consistent with being individually accountable for your actions, and that's something that I think is a virtue within the police service. It's something that comes with the responsibility, as I used to speak to, as I did to every single new recruit, and said that, you know, you've not joined a job, your status has changed, your status is different, you're now the holder of the office of constable, and with that comes that responsibility, comes a privilege to be an officer, but also comes high levels of accountability.
Can we turn to page 22 PDF, please? Page 20. And this relates to Policing Together. The second bullet point, we identified inconsistent understanding of the scope of Policing Together and a degree of confusion about its extensive delivery mechanisms and governance. There also remains some cultural resistance to Policing Together. Some people do not recognise the issues being raised and consider it just another central initiative, with concerns that it may not facilitate the wider cultural change required. To what extent is there a barrier between what would appear to be negative views being held and by certain members of the police?
Well, I'm not surprised that there's some resistance to Policing Together, because there was resistance to the recognition of institutional discrimination and institutional racism. Again, I would say, from my perspective, that's further evidence of the need to take the action that we're taking. The understanding and the awareness of it, well, that again is why communication is a central part of the Policing Together work. You know, crucial, linked into the other areas of training, the prevention that we've discussed, and you know, the responsibilities to go forward and take on those challenges and address some of that negativity that is described there.
Thank you. Could we look at page 23 PDF? Page 21. It relates to outcomes, and The first bullet point says, Police Scotland does not fully understand how culture affects service delivery performance, relying on service satisfaction ratings to assess this. Neither does it effectively measure cultural change and the impact of supporting activity. Would you like to comment on that?
It's a challenge to try and, how do you measure cultural change? I mean, I don't know if it's somewhere within the report, there's no suggestion there about how it should be addressed. As I said earlier, if somebody could point us in the right direction, I'm sure the Police Service of Scotland would go there. But it needs to develop further. Coming back to the policing together work, how do you assess it? How do you evaluate it? How do you make sure that your intentions are being delivered? That gap, again, that you described, Council, between strategy and implementation. So putting all those measures, developing a suite of measures, I know that is part of the policing together work, and no doubt it's difficult, but it's important to do.
And can we look at page 24 now? This is the start of the recommendations of the HMICS, and again, I don't want to go through all of them with you. I'd just like to go through one of them, which is recommendation 2. Police Scotland should develop and deliver a set of actions to address the fundamental inequalities between officers and police staff, the frontline policing and other national specialist functions. Do you have any comments about that recommendation?
I don't know to what the HMI refers in terms of fundamental inequalities. Is it of status, of pay, of career opportunity? I don't really know what that means.
Right. And can we look at recommendation 6? Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority should reinforce the human rights and ethics-based approach for all policing activity. You're nodding, you obviously accept that recommendation.
Well, we've been at the forefront of that, candidly. The HMI are echoing back what Police Scotland has led on, the introduction of human rights into the quality impact assessment, the articulation of human rights in our operational policing, whether it's of protests, whether it's of large-scale events such as COP26 through COVID. Our ability to put human rights at the centre of the work that we're doing, where there was an independent group chaired by John Scott QC, now Lord Scott, and again there was significant oversight that where we were challenging ourselves, ensuring public confidence, because human rights was at the forefront of what we do. As far as I'm concerned, good policing is human rights, and no organisation does more to protect the human rights of our citizens, in my judgment, than the Police Service of Scotland does. So certainly when I was chief, I openly articulated it, and I think there's ample evidence of us doing that. So if it needs reinforced, yep, please do, because it's certainly something I support and have advocated for many years.
And just a couple of matters, again, dealing with the challenge that faces Police Scotland in changing culture and attitudes. Can we look at the PS 18903? We've heard that there was a staff survey done after your institutional racism statement was made. And you'll see that this is a PowerPoint regarding attitudes towards and perceptions of institutional racism within Police Scotland among Police Scotland colleagues. And this is described as strategy, insight and engagement, and it's from November 23. So after you'd retired, but based on information available. It's 17 pages. The second page, the second slide, specifically addresses your address to the SPA. You see that it's referred to there on Thursday the 25th of May 2023, when you addressed institutional discrimination and what you said. And the overarching aim was for the survey seeking to provide Police Scotland colleagues the opportunity to convey their thoughts, feelings and experiences related to discrimination, equality, diversity and inclusion within the service. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we can look at slide 8, please. I think there's just an image of some of the responses. Here we are. That was, sorry, I maybe got the wrong number, but that was the one I wanted. Thank you. And this is institutional discrimination survey respondents. 49 of the respondents were men. Sorry, this isn't the one I wanted actually. Keep going. It looks very similar to that. It maybe was number page 8. Yes, sorry, my mistake. Insights overview. 40% of respondents believe institutional discrimination is an issue for Police Scotland, but equally that would mean 60% think it's not an issue. Is that a concern to think that 60% of the police actually don't think it's an issue at all for Police Scotland?
I don't know how representative the survey or the sample was. I don't know if it was universal or if it was people who self-selected to respond to it. But I'm not particularly surprised that people are resistant. As I said, I understand some of those conflicts. I think my challenge would be, and it's something that we had the responsibility to do. The onus was on us as a leadership team, was to explain what we mean by institutional racism and what it doesn't mean, and therefore, that interpretation, again, I don't know what the validity and rigour of sample size, etc., would be, but it doesn't surprise me that there would be individuals within the service who maybe legitimately don't consider it as an issue. I think it is. I know it to be so. So we need to continue to advocate that. We need to continue to drive the policing together work. We need to continue to communicate on this crucial issue.
And 80% of respondents reported negative conversations on institutional discrimination following your statement. Is this potentially touching on what you expected and what you've told us today? You actually expected people thinking the chief says we're racist?
Well, if I had completed the survey, I would have been part of that 80% as well, because people were critical. People were, in my case, commentators and others at times were very personally and aggressively critical about throwing officers under a bus and exposing them to danger and whatnot, which I genuinely took great exception to, because I'm massively committed and supported to the welfare and well-being of police officers and police staff, and I don't think that was the case. I thought that was unfair, and I thought it was inaccurate in my judgment. But the idea that you would have negative conversations on institutional discrimination, I said, well, I had a number of those, so it doesn't surprise me again.
So you weren't personally being negative, but you were party to conversations where negative views were being expressed.
I thought that's what I said.
Yes.
Reported negative conversations.
Negative conversations.
I think you would have and that could be with friends, casual acquaintances, or it could be with media outlets or others. So again, that doesn't surprise me.
And 41% of respondents agreed the service was taking the right steps to reduce institutional discrimination that may exist. Would you want to express any view on that figure, 41% of respondents?
It's greater than the people who think it, in terms of the progress we're trying to make. There's obviously a whole chunk of people who doesn't think it exists anyway. So, that in terms of the 41% saying we're taking the right steps, there's a large part of this survey, which again I don't know how representative it is, but notwithstanding that, it's the people who believe it is an issue, well, it almost equates to the people who think we're doing the right thing.
And then 7% believe the service provides resources to develop an understanding of institutional discrimination. Is that something you would like to see improved in Police Scotland?
Again, I mean, I come back, if 60% don't think it exists, you know, they're not going to think that we're providing the right resources. So the fact that that figure is close to the 40%, you know, again, seems common sense. It's in the same space, and as we discussed earlier, resources are critical, absolutely critical. Sustained resources over time are absolutely crucial to make progress.
And 79% are aware of the mechanisms in which to report instances of discrimination. Do you wish to comment on that?
It's a relatively high number. I'd like it to be higher. I don't know if this is a definitive survey of the police officers and police staff in Police Scotland. So of the people who have filled it in, 80% or close to 80% seems high, but you know, we would like it, or I would like it as a citizen. I would like that to be as high as possible.
Thank you. And then the final entry there, 50% were confident that if reported an instance of discrimination would be addressed. Again, is that something you'd like to see improved?
Absolutely.
Finally, I'd like to ask you about one matter. You've talked about some negative conversations. You've talked about the challenge of dealing with change and implementing change amongst officers. And I'd like to ask you about the impact that, or the engagement of the Scottish Police Federation and what difference that could make to implementing change more widely in Police Scotland. And it was quite widely reported at the time that there was some criticism from Police Scotland, Scottish Police Federation to your statement about institutional racism, who were concerned about the reputation of members of the police force service, and they felt that in some ways that had been tarnished because of actions of a few, as they described it. And but David Threadgold, chair of the Federation, had said the SPF will always work with the service to identify and remove officers in Scotland who fail to live up to our standards of professional behaviour. Culture in any organisation is changed from the top down, in this case at governmental level. The Chief has to work to ensure that the policing budget is given real terms protection to allow us to maintain our current officer and staff profile, and this relentless stripping of our proud service of physical and human infrastructure has to stop. I'm interested generally in whether you take the view, as former Chief Constable, that the SPF can be part of the move to change, or whether they can in any way hinder that move to change.
The SPF, Scottish Police Federation, can entirely be part of that movement for change. The potential they have is enormous, but I mean, their support to identify officers who conduct themselves contrary to our values and who act in a racist manner, I would expect that, and I think that's right. I think where I was disappointed at the Scottish Police Federation after I made my statement was, you know, they said that, you know, they didn't consider, initially they said that they didn't consider institutional racism and institutional discrimination existed, and that actually, by me saying that, it had damaged officers and made officers vulnerable. I don't think that came to being. I think actually over, as I recall, their positions slightly altered over the weeks when there was greater understanding and clarity of what I was talking about. I was talking about practices, policies, process, cultural issues that are endemic to the organisation. And actually, again, it was important, very, very important to recognise that and then make the change. Federation have an important role, a really important role. I'm very, very supportive of a strong and supportive Scottish Police Federation. You know, their role is for the efficiency of the service, and the welfare of officers. They are there as a critical eye on policing, and you know, they will give whoever the Chief Constable is and the senior team feedback and on many issues, and that's right and proper. But I do think they would be crucial to this acceptance of institutional racism, institutional discrimination, to make the progress that we need. And they need to look to themselves. They need to look how representative they are. They need to look how they are mobilising. And again, I would encourage them to do what I think they are doing. They're beginning to move forward. But they certainly need to be part of the challenge round about improving the culture of the Police Service of Scotland, because they have a leadership responsibility. It's back to what I expected, I required of officers and staff, everyone, to bring this organisation forward, to bring policing forward as a vocation and as a core public service, for it to be anti-racist, that everybody had to take that responsibility. Every single officer, every single member of staff, every structure of an organisation within the service had to be proactive in identifying, recognising and addressing it. And I think the Scottish Police Federation have enormous potential in this area if they were mobilised and directed in the right way.
Thank you. Could you give me a moment, please? Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Are there any Rule 9 applications? Well, Sir Iain, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry and for your personal commitment to the inquiry. I'm very grateful for that. We're going to adjourn now, and you'll then be free to go.
Thank you, Chair.
Adjourn until 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning.